Good morning to everyone that's in the community room here at the Tempe History Museum and those who are watching us on Facebook. We welcome all of you. Just thought I'd let everybody know that March is National Women's Month, and the International Women's Day is today. And I should confess that I really have a fondness for women. My mother was a woman, and my wife is a woman. And I wear ties and things because I don't know if you can see the choke chain marks, but she's rather powerful. The only thing I'm discouraged is that, and I really do celebrate National Women's Month, but what happened to men? Where's Men's Month? And it was probably a man that created National Women. Anyway, enough of that. So welcome. I think we've got a great program for you today. I want to first acknowledge the sponsor of these events, because if we didn't have a institution or a facility like Friendship Village, I'm not sure that we would be able to have the quality of presenters that we do. And Friendship Village has now been a friend of Lunch Talks for at least 5 years or so. And Mark Young is here. Mark is the marketing director for Friendship Village, and I'd like for him to come forward and say a few words of welcome. Anybody here not heard of Friendship Village? Well, there you go, Mark. Nice to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Give a big hand to Mark. All right, moving on.
I can keep this short and sweet since everybody's heard of Friendship Village. We're very proud to be a sponsor of Tempe Historical Society and the Lunch Talks. They're very interesting, and I love being here in person. I know that there is a video of me that plays when I can't be, and I've heard from many of you that it's better for someone to be here in person. So I'm happy to be here. I get here as often as I can, and I'm going to be sitting in the back. So if there's anybody that wants to talk about Friendship Village Tempe and help us celebrate our 43rd anniversary, I would love to speak with you and talk all things Friendship Village. So we love coming out. We're going to continue supporting this program and look forward to many more of these. Thank you.
Yeah, and Mark just told me that next year's sponsorship will be $100,000, so we are really appreciative of that. So be sure and isn't that what you told me? Yes, see, we've got witnesses in the room. So when we come, with hat in hand, it'll be a big hat to fill that up. But thank you, Mark, and thank you to Friendship Village. We really appreciate the support. And those that come out from Friendship Village, how many here today are from Friendship Village? Oh, that's a good turnout. Thank you very much. That really is appreciated. Okay, want to take a moment to introduce to you our speaker today, Dr. Vanessa Fonseca Chavez, and she is an associate professor of English and associate dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the College of Integrative Sciences and Arts at Arizona State University. Oh, I should have finished college. I know that I should have done that because I'm not even sure what I said. Maybe you'll explain that. She's got a whole list of important things, but we wouldn't invite anybody here that doesn't have a good pedigree. And I can give you that whole list, but some of it I don't even understand. But she has written one book, correct? One book. 4 books. I don't have all of that. And she's co-authored several others. So there's all the credentials that you need. What I really like, and she's also a Google Scholar, which I think is a pretty good honor, and I guess that scholar program allows people that are doing research to be able to go to sites that have scholarly papers on whatever subject it is. But to get things down to real earth, Vanessa describes herself as a Chicana from Nueva Mexico, aspiring tortilla maker and avid grower of aloe plants. What else can you possibly say except to welcome Dr. Vanessa Fonseca Chavez?
Probably the funnest introduction I've ever had. Thank you all. I appreciate it. So what was not mentioned is I'm also a department chair and I oversee 83 faculty. So there's many hats that I wear. I wish I didn't wear all the hats sometimes, but there's a lot of good work happening at ASU, and I'm really excited to be a part of the ASU community and to also be a part of the Arizona community. I've now lived in Arizona for 15 years. My husband's from Mesa and is very connected to lots of folks in Mesa. He's a Chavez, and lots of his tios were good friends of Chris Marin's during the Chicano movement, and so that was really exciting to know how connected his family also was to. And we laughed one time saying, I told him, I said, did you ever think about going to New Mexico when you were growing up? And he goes, what, that dirt patch over there to the east? And so I was highly offended. But we also never thought about coming to Arizona. But of course, what I'll talk about today is that Arizona and New Mexico are very connected and have been for a long time. So I hope to tell you a little more about that today. So we're going to see if this is kind of an odd thing where this is behind me, but I'm going to talk to you all. So. All right. So the main thing I want to talk about today is this concept called querencia. Does anyone know what that means? Want to take a guess? Chris does. Chris, tell me what that means for you.
Querencia, a love of homeland, a connection to home in different ways. For Mexicanos, Mexicanas, Chicanas, and others, we have a fondness or a love of home.
Exactly. So the extended definition is kind of up here, and Chris was one of the first, I think she called herself a homegirl from Arizona one of the first times I met her. So it was also interesting to learn more about Arizona's history through Chris when I was here as a graduate student. So querencia is a Spanish word, and it comes from two different words in Spanish. The first is querer, and the second is herencia, and it essentially means a desire or an attachment, or a desire or a want for an inheritance or a heritage. So essentially it is a deep connection to place. It's where someone finds their truest sense of place, where they feel like they have a sense of self and a sense of community. So really connecting the I to the we within communities, and where people feel their strongest self. Ernest Hemingway, who you all probably know as an author, writes about the bull in the bull ring and his querencia, which is the one place in the bull ring where the bull feels his strongest self and where he cannot be impaled by the bullfighter. So it's an interesting concept, and it exists in lots of places throughout the Spanish-speaking world. But Chris is correct in saying for Mexicanos, Chicanos, Mexican Americans, it is a really strong sense of place. One of the books that I've co-edited came out in 2020, Querencia, Reflections on a New Mexico Homeland. And this book was an attempt for 15 or 16 different scholars to write about what it means to feel a sense of querencia or to embody querencia within New Mexico. I'm a proud Nuevo Mexicana from Grants, New Mexico, from Western New Mexico. And so we think about this as a deeply rooted knowledge of place. For us, this is really connected to, I'm a 16th generation New Mexican, which means that my family arrived during the Spanish colonial period. That's true of lots of families in New Mexico, but it also means that we're part of a very complicated history. Folks who colonized indigenous people, and then during the 19th century, we were colonized by the United States. And so part of what I write about and talk about often is just this really complicated sense of history that we embody as folks who reside and have resided in the Southwest for a long time. But we respect this place and all its complexities, and we respect our own complex identities. So we have a number of different sort of frameworks when we're thinking about this this word querencia. And does anyone know who Rodolfo Anaya is in the room? Wonderful, a couple. So he's largely known as the godfather of Chicano literature. He was from northeastern New Mexico, rather, and one of his most important books was Bless Me Ultima. Has anyone ever read that book? Okay. It's one of those books that when we were kids, we read it in 4th grade, and then we read it in 12th grade, and then we read it in college, and there was always something new to learn about it. But Rodolfo Anaya wrote the foreword to this book, and he has sort of a framework where he thinks about the many different ways that querencia functions. And the first is to think about the solar, which is your home space. So think about it as the I space. So how are you thinking about your attachment to place, and how are you honoring the place where you are from? It's a very sort of intimate space, the solar. And then that connects to Resolana, and Tomás Atencio wrote extensively about Resolana as a form of knowledge. But Resolana really in New Mexico is sort of that sunny space on the side of the building where the viejitos gathered to talk about anything they wanted to talk about. They would share kind of information about their families. They would talk about what was going on around the town. And that Resolana space has turned into lots of different things over time. So maybe it's not necessarily viejitos sitting on the side of a building in the sun, but maybe it's folks at a coffee shop or folks in digital spaces who continue to share knowledge and goings on of their community. The third part is Patria Chica, which is our connection to the nation. So our connection as Mexicoamericanos, as Chicanos to the United States. And again, just kind of going back to that complicated history that we inherit as products of colonizers and colonized peoples. Fourthly, there's the vecinos, so not necessarily your next door neighbor, but the kind of network of neighbors that you create over time. It was really lovely to walk in the room and to see the immediate kind of vecino network that was created in here, where folks are coming together who have recognized each other at different walks in life and who share stories and share, different work that they're doing. So this is kind of one way to think about it, but there's a second model also that I want to share, which is the cultural landscape model, and this is more related to how we interact with the natural and physical systems around us. So the natural system is really just sort of the environment in which we live. Let's think about it as sort of untouched by man. The mountains, the hills, the plains, the rivers, how they help us to understand where we are and the knowledge systems that we have in place. So if you think about, for example, indigenous homelands, Dene peoples, for example, recognize 4 sacred mountains as part of their traditional homelands. And so you see kind of that mountain structure, and that landscape structure is really important to the way that people navigate their sense of place. And then you have the physical systems, which are the systems, the built environments that we create on top of those natural systems. We know that the Salt River canals were really important for Hohokam people in the Southwest. In New Mexico, it was the acequias, which are ancient waterways also that we use. And there's a whole kind of complex system around acequias where we have mayordomos, and we come out during El Dia de San Juan to sort of start cleaning out and baptizing those waters. And then you have common lands, which before were most often known as mercedes, so land grants. Land grants had both private property and they had communal property. And in a land grant system, you were not able to ever sell common lands, because that's what you would use to graze your animals, to plant your farms, etc. So common lands are more closely associated with that idea of the land grant system. And then thirdly, you have this sociocultural system where you think about the way that we as people interact with both the physical and the natural system. And a lot of really important concepts come out of this, like reciprocity. So, we live in communities where work has to be done. There's not a lot of conversation about gender dynamics within those spaces. It's like if the cows have to get fed, we got to go feed the cows. It doesn't really matter who goes to feed the cows. It just has to get done. So we recognize the work that has to get done, and we work together to get that work finished. The second is tareas de obligación, and I think probably the most accurate translation of this is sort of the fundamental responsibility that you feel to take care of your community. So what is it that draws you to keep stories? What is it that draws you to practice practices related to your ancestors or to generations prior to you? And then the third is resiliency, which is that if we're thinking about living within a colonial system, how have we practiced survival? How have we practiced resilience? How are we ensuring that the stories of our ancestors are still stories that we're telling today? And then that really moves into intergenerational capacity, because if we are able to carry those stories through the generations, we can ensure one more generation of continuity. That's a resilient strategy as well. Within Chicano and Chicana literature, we most often think about this within 3 generations. The Chicana grandmother is a really big archetype within literature for us. So it's what we learn from our grandmother, passed down to our mother, and then what we inherit. But within indigenous systems, that really looks like a 7-generation model. So what you inherit from 3 generations prior and what you pass on to 3 generations after you. So this is just kind of a mapping to show you that these are all interrelated. They are highly dependent upon one another to be able to really sustain the cultural landscape. This is in the context of New Mexico, of course, but that can be applied to lots of other communities. All right, so within all of this, and I will get to Eastern Arizona, I promise. There's a lot of questions that I, as a scholar, a researcher, a community participant, have when we're thinking about querencia and how it functions within our communities. If people have a sort of sense of place, is it also possible to develop multiple love of place, multiple sites where, you love Arizona just as much as you love New Mexico, or you love Wyoming as much as you love another place. It also doesn't have to be a physical space. So, people would say, I love the feeling of biting into a sopapilla. I probably said that. I love the feeling of biting into a sopapilla. That is a querencia sentiment for me, and I think it really connects to that last question about what cultural remnants help us to understand that. Because I'm always on the search for the best New Mexican restaurant in the Valley. I think it's Blue Adobe in Mesa. If anybody has other opinions, please let me know. But one of the kind of markers for me of real culinary New Mexico is that you give me free chips and salsa and you give me free sopapillas. And I think the only place that does that is Si Senor, so they get to be higher up on my list because of that. But, if you need suggestions on a New Mexican restaurant, I'm here for you. But how do we practice our querencia? How do we carry it with us? How do we remember it when we're away from that initial kind of site that we hold close to us? I mentioned that I've now lived in Arizona for 15 years, and for 25 years I lived in New Mexico. And so I'm coming up on the point where, I've lived outside of New Mexico as long as I've lived in it. And so I think about these things all the time. So one of the projects that I started working on to really delve into this topic of how New Mexicans migrate. In New Mexico, we often call these manitos. Has anyone ever heard the term manito before? Love it. Tell me where you first heard this.
My father had a trucking business, and we used to go from Palosin to Grants, New Mexico every year. And one year, my mother went into premature labor, and one of my sisters was born in Gallup. So we refer to her as the foreigner in our family, because we were all born in Arizona. We call her la mamita.
From New Mexico. Wonderful. Another person in the audience who raised their hands. Yes.
I heard the term the very first time, and we were picking cotton when I was growing up.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways. So manito for New Mexican families, anyway, can mean a number of things. So it could be related to working in the filas, which is that, people often refer to each other as hermano or hermana, which is brother or sister, and manito is a shortened form of that. And so you would often refer to each other as manito or manita or mano or mana. And sometimes in the agricultural fields, when the patrones or the owners would hear this, they would start to refer to the same population in a derogatory way. So it might have been a term of endearment with your kind of compadres or your comadres, but the owners might take that and turn it into something else. So that is one story that we hear often. Yes?
In Clinton, Morenci area, we used to use it for people that are from New Mexico or from Colorado, an endearment. That's the way we use that.
Yes, love it. So that's a second one. So it's a term of endearment, and most often in New Mexico and likely with other Hispanic families, the eldest brother or sister was almost always referred to as just mano or mana or manito or manita. And in English, it would just be brother or sister. My mom is always referred to as sister because she's the oldest of the cousins. And so they never refer to her by her first name. And so, but in Spanish, it would be either mano or mana, manita or manito. So there's a lot of different places where this word comes from and a lot of different uses. We are working on tracing it back to, what its possible origins might be, but gosh, that's going to be some hard work. Pete.
Yes, one version I heard is the separation between the Nuevo Mexicanos and then the primarily Mexican immigrants that come with the revolution, looking at the Nuevo Mexicanos as manitos perdidos, or those who don't really know who they are because they're not the Mexicans from Mexico. And there is a separation sense of place, because the Nuevo Mexicanos say, hey, we've been here since the 16th century, 17th century. So there is a little bit place there. And besides that, there's also the way of speaking that's slightly different, more 16th, 17th, 18th century Spanish that you find up in the mountains of New Mexico.
Yep, absolutely. And you see this because so prior to the Mexican-American War, most of the inhabitants of what is now the present-day Southwest lived in the present-day state of New Mexico. Before it was just called La Nueva Mexico, and then the territory of New Mexico. But you have these isolated kind of villages that have spoken a particular dialect of Spanish for a very long time. And so you can point out a New Mexican pretty easily by their speech patterns, and then just kind of, again, the way that they carry their querencia. And what's interesting in eastern eastern Arizona rather, is people will make the distinction between Mexicans from here and Mexicans from there. And so that's also kind of important to point out. Yes, ma'am. And we'll just wait for that mic. We're going to make him work today.
In the 1780s, my great-grandfather, Juan Nicanor Padilla, came to Arizona, and he actually settled in the area that's now called Horsehead Crossing. And they still own the property, which is, there's not much there. But I've been doing some research, and it's just such an interesting story. So we're from there, too.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and the Padillas tend to be a very well-known kind of New Mexican name. There's lots of Padillas in eastern Arizona as well. So I already love this story sharing space. We'll take one more, and then we'll... Of course.
And I'm not from New Mexico, but what I've noticed is those communities that you were referring to that were very isolated and maybe even had a different way of speaking, they tend to be more geographically located in the northern part of the state, in southern Colorado, in that general vicinity. I mean, that's been my experience, at least.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so northern New Mexico and southern Colorado are kind of thought of as this kind of extended homeland where they share a lot of different linguistic and cultural features. Ruben Cobos wrote a dictionary of southern Colorado and New Mexican Spanish, and so that's a really good resource if you are more interested in kind of the dialectical, variety that's spoken in New Mexico. All right, so I'm not going to read through that whole thing, but I started working, as I am a Hispanic New Mexican, but I am also, very connected to these stories of, my own querencia, my own homeland. And since I was a master's student at the University of New Mexico, I've been really interested in collecting oral histories and in the way that communities tell stories. So in 2015, I became the co-director of this Following the Manito Trail project. And at that time, I was an assistant professor of English at the University of Wyoming. And this project, writ large, looks at the different kinds of migration paths that Manitos took from the 1800s to the present. A lot of the individuals who are in Wyoming, there's about 30% of the population is of the population that identifies as Mexican American, 30% of those individuals are initially from New Mexico. So there's a long history of migration of Manitos from northern New Mexico up to Wyoming. And so when I was there, I led a team to collect we did about 40 oral history interviews, and then we worked with a photographer to produce 3 different documentary films. One is this really great film on, it's called Wyoming Snow, but it's a song that one of the, younger folks whose grandfather, I think, came to Wyoming from New Mexico, had written about this really bad snowstorm in the 1940s. So there are a lot of folks that went to Wyoming in the 1940s, and they stayed there because they got stuck in Wyoming because of the snow. And so it's a really interesting story, and you hear it repeated often with people. And so there wasn't an option to kind of pack up and go back home because you got snowed in. And if you've ever been to Laramie when it's snowy, they actually have an arm that comes down, and you cannot get out of town. You're not allowed to leave town when it's snowing. So in the 3 years that I lived there, that was a little bit depressing to know that you couldn't go if you wanted to go. So in addition to this, our team co-curated a Manito Trail exhibit at the University of Wyoming's American Heritage Center. And this you can't see too well, but it's a larger canvas that probably took about half a wall here. And this was just kind of the different faces of the Manitos that we had interviewed and we had spoken with during our time there. And then I have a couple of articles, one published in the Annals of Wyoming, which is a regional Wyoming history journal, which narrates the origins of the Manito Trail Project. And the cover of that is this really great mural from Connie Coca, who owned the first bilingual radio station in the state of Wyoming, but her family is from the Las Vegas and Mora area in New Mexico. There's a couple of other, the very stately looking gentleman at the top toward the center is Floyd Esquivel. He was a senator. And then there are other folks in there. Debari Martinez next to La Virgen de Guadalupe, who was the first Hispanic mayor in the state of Wyoming. And so there's a lot of people who've had a lot of influence in the state of Wyoming over time who are New Mexican in origin. So I have another publication that I co-authored with one of our Manito Trail scholars, Trisha Martinez, that situates the oral histories of Manitos in Wyoming within the broader context of Greater Mexico, and then within the context of immigration, migration, and placemaking. And then I have a forthcoming book chapter that focuses on Chicana activism in Riverton, Feliz Dia de las Mujeres, and the strategies Chicanas used to mobilize their communities in the 1970s and 1980s. And that chapter really relies heavily on those oral histories that we had done in Wyoming. Another really fun area, I don't know that we're going to get to view this. We probably don't have time, but one of the very interesting parts of looking at these kind of cultural remnants that folks took with them is looking at the different aspen carvings that Manito sheep herders left on trees. We were able to document trees as early as 1907, and aspen trees have about a 100-year lifespan, and so it was kind of incredible that they were still standing. There's a lot of issues with bark beetle and a lot of issues with just deforestation efforts in general, but what era do you think that this was carved in just by the way that the woman looks? Any? Probably 1940s, right? So she was on many trees. She doesn't have a name, but she's really beautiful. And so no surprise, the men carved a lot of women onto trees. You know, this is one example, and then this short documentary also shows places where we have more information about these migrations. So it would say, for example, Taos, New Mexico, Martinez, 1936, right? So you know exactly who the gentleman's last name was, where they were from, and then in what year were they sheep herding through that area. So I'm happy to give links to this afterwards, and then y'all can check it out. We also care about the little ones. So in 2021, we had a second exhibit at the Millicent Rogers Museum in Taos, New Mexico, and this was mostly focused on families who left Taos to migrate to other places in the American West. And this is a colcha design, which uses sheep wool. And this was from the 1930s. And so we created these K through 12 educator packets based on New Mexico social studies standards. And so here, the K through 4 kiddos had an opportunity to draw their own or to color in their own colcha design. So it was kind of fun. So we're trying to get the whole like intergenerational, you know, community here. So you're not going to be able to see this map very well, it turns out, but y'all know the state that you live in, so, and what it looks like generally speaking. So we do have most of the research that I'm doing right now. I came back to ASU in 2016, and I work out at the Polytechnic campus. Has anyone ever been there? Okay. So most people don't know where it is or think it's too far to drive. It's in the Far East Valley. Used to be the Air Force Base. So when I returned to Arizona in 2016, I started thinking about, well, what does it look like? What does this diaspora look like between New Mexico and Arizona? And, you know, we know that following the Mexican-American War, borders were created by the U.S. to establish Arizona and New Mexico as separate territories. And then we also know that Arizona and New Mexico were both granted statehood in 1912 on January 6th and February 14th, respectively. And then as these borders became more defined, Hispano communities continued to exist on both sides of the border. My family is from western New Mexico. You can't locate the town now because it's a ghost town, but it was Atarque, which is near Fence Lake and Zuni Pueblo. So if anyone knows anything about Atarque, I'd love to talk to you. So does anyone know anything about Atarque in the room? Yes. Okay. All right. You're not from New Mexico, but you sure know a lot back there. Perfect. All right. So we know that migration was more fluid between Arizona and New Mexico, and the sense of querencia kind of engulfed a larger border region than what was evident, for example, in the diaspora of Manitos that left New Mexico to go to Utah or California or Nevada. The really most cohesive sense that we have is southern Colorado and northern New Mexico, which is, again, that larger kind of community. So evidence of a shared homeland transcending territorial and state borders exist, for example, in the formation of Catholic institutions. The Diocese of Gallup, which was formed in 1939, encompasses a 55,000 square mile region serving eastern Arizona and western New Mexico. And the church that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, San Rafael Mission Church, falls under the diocese. It's also the poorest diocese in the United States. And so I think it's also interesting to kind of think about not only the grand region that they encompass, but what are the kind of economic challenges that they face as well. So eastern Arizona is an important location of research because rural Hispano communities along the eastern Arizona and western New Mexico border remain underdocumented. Our friend Pete Dimas here has done a lot of really great work, as well as Chris Marin, who's writing some great stories about education in eastern Arizona, and Laura Munoz, who's at the University of Nebraska. And so there's a lot of folks who have done work over time that give us kind of these segmented understandings of what's happening in eastern Arizona, and I hope that I can contribute to some of that as well. But most of these communities are often thought of as vestiges of past economic booms or these vanishing villages that couldn't combat modernization. That was certainly true of my grandmother's hometown of Atarque. But since the late 1800s, ethnic and religious communities migrated to eastern Arizona. Most of the folks who are migrating over to eastern Arizona are Nuevo Mexicano communities, leaving the more densely populated area of Albuquerque or Belen, Los Lunas, Socorro, kind of those areas, and they're migrating westward to start sheep herding. And they're finding themselves in Quemado, in San Rafael, in San Mateo, in Grants, and then really closer to the eastern Arizona border. And there were a lot of Catholic Hispanos who were migrating from western New Mexico to Concho and to St. John's and to Springerville and some of these other communities. At the same time, Brigham Young was calling for Mormon settlers to colonize the area for the LDS Church. And so you're finding this really interesting confluence of, and I think Al, you said this, these kind of feelings about what happens when like the Mormons and the Catholics come together. And that's kind of a really big sticking point for eastern Arizona and western New Mexico, really. I don't think I realized that when I was growing up, but later on I realized. So the project that I'm really working on looks at how the folks in Concho and St. John's are navigating their sense of place or their querencia through these economic migrations that started in the late 1800s, but who also have been communities deeply rooted to the places they're from in the midst of all these kind of extractive industries. So, you know, the power plant is now closing, you know, coal mines are, you know, have an uncertain future, but you have these communities that continue to stay and continue to return. And part of that is, you know, me trying to understand what is the rationale for this? What is the reason that people want to so closely guard that querencia, right? And a lot of the folks that I talk to, and likely some of the folks that Pete Dimas has talked to in these oral history interviews, is really trying to understand and voice their own history in a region that really is kind of overshadowed by LDS histories and Anglo-Mormon histories. So, all right. So what's interesting here is, like I said, my grandmother is from Atarque, New Mexico. Her prima hermana, which is her first cousin, Pauline Chavez Bent, wrote a lovely book about Atarque. But one of kind of the settlement history of this region, Juan Garcia was the first person to come to Atarca, New Mexico in 1882, and he said, "En ese tiempo no había gente blanca entre San Rafael, Nuevo Mexico, and St. John's, Arizona." So there were no white folks between San Rafael and St. John's. It used to be called San Juan. I'm a little bit confused about why that wasn't written on there. So because it was Anglo settlers that changed the name to St. John's. So if this is like inscribed in a rock, then they got the name wrong because it was San Juan before the white folks arrived. So that's a side point. I can't change what's on that rock. So that's the scholar in me. I'm like, wait a minute. So there's very little scholarship on Hispano populations in eastern Arizona and western New Mexico, mostly because, one, the LDS are just really good record keepers, and so they tend to be very diligent about record keeping, but that history also, like I said, overshadows some of the Mexicano and Chicano contributions and Hispano contributions to the area. But Arizona generally tends to privilege the history of the U.S. colonial period and the settler colonial narrative of Anglo conquest. This is true of eastern Arizona and western New Mexico beginning in the late 1800s. There are a couple of individuals, I mentioned Pete and Laura, for example, but there's also folks like Pauline Chavez Bent and Abelicio Peña, whose books are here, who worked during their lifetimes to contest these otherwise dominant narratives. Pauline Chavez Bent grew up in western New Mexico, but spent a lot of time in Chambers, Arizona, in her later life. Her family is from both eastern Arizona and western New Mexico. And then Abelicio Peña is from San Mateo, New Mexico, but when he's writing about these stories, he's connecting the different villages throughout western New Mexico in terms of those who, most of the folks who ran sheep. So the Mirabal family in San Rafael, the Peña family in San Mateo, the Landavazos and Garcias in Atarca, New Mexico, and they're connecting that through also the Candelarias, for example, who settled Concho and were sheep herders. So each of these authors demonstrate the interconnectedness of eastern Arizona and western New Mexico, and they do this by sharing the histories of settlement, the primary economies that drove migration to these regions, and the prominent Hispano families in the region who led these efforts. And they were really involved in oral history interviews and storytelling, so I think it's also important to recognize how community historians have uplifted a lot of this work as well. In Concho, there's one book that seems to be sort of the fountain of information, and it's Concho, the Enchanted Pearl, which is off to the right side. It's not in print anymore, but the University of New Mexico at the Center for Southwest Research has a PDF copy of the book if anyone's interested. I also might have a PDF copy in my files. So this was written in 1981, and it was published by the Concho Historical Society. That historical society doesn't exist anymore, but there are talks now about reviving that. There are 6 religious brothers who just moved from Los Angeles to Concho, and now they have a farm, and they're raising chickens, and they're doing all this great work in Concho, really doing a lot of cool stuff to revive the community. In eastern Arizona, there's also where the Apache County Historical Society Museum is. They have a couple of analog exhibits of Hispano or Mexicano families. One is the St. John's Fiesta analog exhibit. They have an exhibit on Las Tusas, and then they also have an exhibit on the Hispanic founding families of St. John's, and that was put together by Pauline Chavez Bent, I think in the late 90s, early 2000s. And there's also an oral history collection of Hispanic families from Eager and Springerville that's on the County Library District website, and a really great Facebook group, if you don't already know about it, Las Primeras Familias del Rio Colorado Chiquito, which is the first families of the Little Colorado River. That group mostly focuses on genealogical research, but they also share a lot of really great photos from the area. This article off to the left was written by Keith Cunningham. In 1993, the Arizona Humanities Council organized an initiative to document religion in the history of Arizona. So Keith Cunningham went to the St. Raphael Mission Church in Concho, and he interviewed 31 quote-unquote old-timers in Concho, and he wrote this article, which mostly focuses on the preservation of folklore, and it documents the folklore of the region, including the pilgrimages that Concho and St. John's residents would take to El Santo Niño de Atocha Capilla in Zuni. And the story also, or the article also talks about La Llorona, Don Cacahuate, and Don Piñon, which very much marks it as New Mexican in kind of cultural practices. So there's a clear connection to New Mexico Hispano traditions and storytelling. And then at that time in 96, Cunningham said that no research had been produced on Hispanic families in eastern Arizona, but we know that since then a number of folks have been involved. All right, so I have there are three different things I've got going on in Concho right now. I've been going there since early 2020, so the past few years. Pete, you may recognize some of these folks as people you maybe interviewed in the past. But the first was this set of oral history interviews, and this started, my kind of training in oral history started in 2018. I'm not a historian, I'm a literature person, so this is kind of a new avenue of inquiry for me, but I've always, like I said, been very interested in storytelling, and this is just a great avenue for it. So in 2018, I participated in the Voces Oral History Institute at UT Austin. It was a week-long training to really delve into topics around oral history research. And then in 2019, I spent the summer at in a Center for Regional Studies fellowship at the University of New Mexico. And this is when I first started looking at archival research on communities in western New Mexico and eastern Arizona. It was 3 months that I spent there listening to oral histories from the 70s and 80s, reading newspapers, and then talking with archivists about the region's history, and then melding that, of course, with my own knowledge, so that kind of that solage space that I had into kind of a Resolana space with the archivists. And then I also had a Borders and Boundaries faculty fellowship with the Institute for Humanities Research at ASU, which gave us money to go to Concho and conduct interviews in January of 2020. So I took 2 graduate students, and we conducted 16 interviews over a 2-day period. And they also learned about best practices for oral history research. One was really focused on the stories that women tell, which is very appropriate for today. And then the other student was from Wyoming, and so she had kind of a rural context. She grew up as an LDS person, and then she came over and kind of bridged her knowledge of kind of Wyoming rural spaces to that of eastern Arizona. So the folks that we interviewed were aged 65 to 85. There were 8 women and 8 men, which was kind of good statistically. We didn't plan it that way, but that was kind of nice that it worked out that way. And 2 of the interviewees that I wanted to highlight are Angie Murphy and Matias Montoya. So I have 2 articles drafted related to these particular oral histories that we conducted in 2020. The first, by Angie Murphy, is about the way that women navigate the impositions of the Catholic Church and how their family histories provide important moments of reflection when they're considering their own reproductive capacities. Matias Montoya, he was in his 80s at the time, so he's just a few years older now. But here I explored how Hispano men like Matias, who identify as Catholic, are often discriminated against by the Anglo-LDS residents within their own communities. In doing so, he developed various strategies linked to citizenship and equality that drove his desire to assert his legal rights relating to land and water. And then in addition to kind of finding these gems of people, I also encountered the stunning collection of photos by Russell Lee on religious life in Concho in the 1940s, and this is part of the Library of Congress collections. There's another collection of photos by John Collier Jr., who photographed rural Hispano communities in western New Mexico during the same time period. So I'd love to also, have a chapter or an article around religious imagery in the New Mexico-Arizona borderlands, and these 1940s photos provide a really good basis for doing that. In 2020, when did I go there? 20? So in 2020, I received a Whiting Foundation Public Engagement Seed Grant that we had intended to use to support community storytelling workshops, very much in the spirit of some of the work that Mrs. Irma Payan does here, and to create some public-facing materials on Hispano communities to further bolster the presence of their narratives. But because of COVID-19, we couldn't do community storytelling workshops. We couldn't gather large groups of people in the same place. So, but what I did notice is I would still continue to go to Concho, and inevitably every time I would go, we would end up at the Concho Catholic Cemetery. So these are images of one of the oldest residents, Juan Candelaria, and then one of the newest residents, Porfi Padilla. So you have the Padillas, the Candelarias, which I think Al is related to, correct? Yeah. So we have these kind of histories, and Porfi Padilla was actually one of the individuals that we had met in January of 2020, but had since passed away by the time I came back to visit the community. So during each of these visits, community members would point out where their ancestors were buried, and they would recount the stories they remembered about them. And then every time I called a community member on the phone, it would almost always start with, did you hear so-and-so passed away? And we go to the cemetery to visit that burial plot. But what's really interesting too is that while some of these are very nicely maintained, others are not. So not all of the headstones in the cemetery are able to be identified. And so what we did was start a Concho Catholic Cemetery digitization project where a graduate student and I utilized the funds from this grant to purchase 15 headstones to place in the Concho Catholic Cemetery for family members who didn't have funds to purchase their own. In exchange, the family member or community member shared a story about the deceased loved one. And I think this is really nice because in 1996, when Keith Cunningham wrote his article about Concho, he said that cemeteries are an intersection between past and present, and he says there's always this constant interaction between the living and those who have passed away in the town of Concho, and even since 1996, that still is true. We also work to digitize more than 500 burials in the cemetery. San Rafael Church has an interesting system for cataloging their burials. There is a giant poster board that has a hand-drawn grid where everybody is kind of like located. It's inaccurate, which is fine, but it's just an example of how kind of these smaller communities, if we remember also that the diocese is the poorest in the country, there's not always the economic resources available to be able to do the kind of digitization or archival preservation work that you might want to do. And so this, really affects small communities. And then the third project that I've been working on is in fall of 2022, my graduate student and I attended the St. Raphael Parish Fiestas to document the celebration. It hadn't taken place for many, many years, largely because of COVID, but also because of kind of a decreased interest, not a decreased interest in the community necessarily, but lack of kind of community like esfuerzo, I guess. So local photographer from where was he from? Xolo, not Snowflake. He's from Xolo. Victor Chavez, he came out and captured still images and drone footage of the church procession, the fiestas, and the mass at the church. And during this time, people started recounting their own baptisms, weddings, and other celebrations that were held at the church. And a local Hispano, Abe Salas, shared that his grandmother donated the building where the church is currently located. It used to be a brothel and then a mercantile store, so that's kind of a fun history. And these religious brothers that came from LA were really committed to reinvigorating the church as it prepares for its 100th anniversary. And so you can't tell the story of Concho, Arizona without telling the story of this church, which draws its name from St. Raphael, New Mexico. So where there's no white people, right, between St. Raphael and St. John's. So that name transferred also, and a lot of the religious practices transferred as well. Does anyone know who the Hermanos Penitentes are? Okay, all right, non-New Mexico guy back here for the win all the time. So the Penitentes were a religious brotherhood that existed mostly in northern New Mexico, but there are, and they run the moradas, which are kind of, it's like I don't know how morada translates. I'm sorry? It's a meeting place. It's not a capilla or a chapel, but it's something just for the Hermanos Penitentes. But what's very interesting is that the farthest north that you can locate a morada is in Denver, Colorado, which again shows evidence of that diaspora. And the farthest east is in Concho, Arizona. So it's kind of interesting also to kind of see how those religious practices are migrating also. So as St. Raphael prepares to approach its 100th anniversary, we're thinking about this oral history collection dedicated to how community members have formed relationships to their faith, their home parish, and how they navigated their identities within the Catholic Church. And it wasn't lost upon me that the very first interaction I had with the community of Concho was at Mass. So, I arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, and the first thing I did was go to church, and there was Angie Murphy there leading the rosary. And I told my graduate students at the time, this is a must. You must come to church because this is where you're going to meet everybody in this community to hear their stories. And then, of course, that led to those invites to do those 16 oral history interviews afterwards. So being able to share this knowledge with the other kind of interviewers, I now have this other project funded by the University of Texas at Austin, the Center for Mexican American Studies, and the Voces Oral History Project. They're going to come and bring a whole production team to Concho this summer. And they said, you're really bringing us to the middle of nowhere. And it's true. So they're going to come out this summer and they're going to do these full-scale video interviews of folks who are telling their stories about their relationships to the Catholic Church in preparation for this anniversary. So we're really excited about that. I'm also just very excited that so many people want to fund this research, which has been really great. I think we've had about $70,000 in grant support for the Manito Trail Project since 2015. And then other kinds of grant opportunities that allow for things like these really great oral history documentation projects. So I think I'm going to stop there. I'm out of slides, and I'm long-winded, but I'm going to, I'd love to hear from y'all. So thank you very much.
Hold on for just a minute. Yeah.
We got to get him ready to run around with this mic.
Yeah, because we've got it going streaming, we need to make sure that we've got a mic.
I just had, regarding the oral history, there is an oral history that was published in Holbrook, Arizona, their 100-year celebration, and my uncle, Ignacio Padilla, has about 4 pages about the family history in that oral publication. So that might be something you look at.
Absolutely, yeah. So I didn't include it here, but there's there's a trilogy. Rosa Archuleta Sheets has written this trilogy on Chicanos and Mexicanos in Holbrook. And so, in Winslow rather. And so there's a lot more happening farther kind of west. I haven't gotten there yet, but.
You know where I found it? At the Arizona History Museum.
Perfect.
In Tucson.
Okay.
They were able to get that because in actual Holbrook, my family doesn't have copies of it.
Of course they do. Well, this is the other challenge, is that you want to make sure that whatever is being published and whatever is being shared is accessible to the very communities that it's intended to serve. And so that is, you don't want to write about people and then not ever give them access to that material. Let's go to Pete and then we'll come back.
Not loud enough to get over the airwaves.
Okay, I'd just like to make 2 comments that meld into what you were saying. You mentioned the LDS and the Catholic, actually the Mexican, the Nuevo Mexicano. Conflict might be a strong word, but there's some of that there. The book that you had on Concho was written by E.M. DeGlane. It was a Nuevo Mexicano from the northeastern Arizona who migrated over there, and he became a Mormon. So and his wife never became a Mormon. She was Padilla, who remained Catholic in their small house. But the way he wrote that thing was, you could see the clear divide. One half of it is the Nuevo Mexicano side, and the other half of it is the Mormon side. And his interview was very interesting, the way he maneuvered through that. The other thing I wanted to just touch on, because most people don't understand that the Nuevo Mexicanos were very political. It was a self-defense move. And much of their political organization came through the penitentes, the moradas, because the Catholic Church did not want to have the New Mexican influence. As a matter of fact, in order to un-Mexicanize the Nuevo Mexicanos, they brought in a French bishop, Lemay, who brought in all these French missionaries, which basically drove the Mexican Catholic Church under and below ground, in other words, to the penitentes.
Yep.
And that's where a lot of the political organizations took place in the 1880s. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, you're
And
absolutely
it
right.
transferred over to eastern Arizona.
Yeah, and even with identity, a lot of folks in New Mexico will say that they're Spanish American, but some of that is that they we used to joke and say, did a parachute arrive from Spain? But you start to understand more about it, and it was a political strategy because there was no way that New Mexico was going to be admitted into the United States without proving how non-Mexican they were. And that was part of the reason why it took 64 years for New Mexico to become a state. There were numerous legislators across the United States who said, we do not want poor Catholic, Mexican, Spanish-speaking individuals as part of this country. And so a lot of the strategy was for them to say, we're not actually Mexican, we are European in origin through the Spanish colonization. And so it was an interesting move. Remnants of that still exist. Yeah, right over here.
Yes, a few years ago at Arizona Historical Society conference, there was a lady who gave a lecture on the sheep in eastern Arizona. And one of her comments after the lecture, I was talking to her, and she said the thing she really wasn't sure of is why they came, all the New Mexicans, with the sheep. But she pointed out the Candelarias and all the sheep owners who came. And in later readings, see, I've read the Civil War History of the New Mexico Volunteers Militia by Thompson, a book I picked up at the University of New Mexico Library. Great library, by the way. Mm-hmm. Anyway, in the book, they talk about, Kit Carson had the 1st Cavalry Regiment of New Mexico. And towards the end of the Civil War, when he was tasked to round up the Navajos and take them to the Bosque, at the end, when he thought he had cleaned out all of Navajo land, he thought he had not found other Ricos with the huge herds of sheep. So he went scouring through Arizona and everywhere with the whole regiment to find, the Ricos. And they crossed the Little Colorado at Horsehead Crossing, which was her great-grandfather's, became his ranch and everything. But in their writings, going through the White Mountains and everything, you see the writings of how great it would be for sheep country, cattle country, the water. It was, everybody thought it was just beautiful. And this was 1865 time period. So do you think there was a connection with everybody? And then in the regiment, the way they formed it, they took I guess you call it Ricos, or the head people in the villages. And one I saw in the book was like Candelaria. And they would make them a captain, and they would form a regiment, a company, a cavalry company. And these were all the people who went, through the White Mountains in New Mexico. Have you ever found a connection where, this is what they saw, and then that caused, 20 years later, a flow of New Mexicans coming to Arizona?
Yeah, let's talk more. It's really interesting because most of the individuals who were prominent during that period were sheep herders, people who ran sheep. So David Garcia in Atarque, the Landavasos in Magdalena, for example. Magdalena is where the stock drive was. And so it was very common for people to kind of use that pathway to run sheep and to run cattle. And then you had Don Silvestre Mirabal, who was from San Rafael, New Mexico, who was the richest man in the New Mexico, I think it was then a state by the 1920s. But you have all of the individuals who really consolidate a lot of political power, and they all band together around the 1930s when the Taylor Grazing Act was passed, which limited the amount of grazing lands that were available to sheep herders. And that was in favor of cattle ranching. And so you had this really big, in Wyoming, you saw more prominently the sheep and cattle wars kind of play out, but certainly that happened in eastern Arizona. And a lot of people started writing letters to Dennis Chavez, who was the senator in New Mexico during that time period, saying really like that they're losing their political power by way of this Taylor Grazing Act. And if it was really hurting kind of these small sheep herder companies, and then favoring a lot of folks who, by the 1930s, you had a lot of Anglos who were coming out to western New Mexico and eastern Arizona as Dust Bowl refugees. And so you had like a shift in political power ethnically, and then you also had the decline of the sheep herding industry by that time period. But I wasn't aware of kind of the connections to, Kit Carson grabbing all the folks who had political power. That sounds about right. Yes.
One of the things I was curious about, there are two Mexican states that are different. Below, south of Arizona is Sonora, and south of New Mexico is Chihuahua. Mm-hmm. Have you noticed, were there any cultural differences or slight variations? And I assume those from Chihuahua were coming through there, came to New Mexico, and from Sonora into Arizona. Are there any differences that in those folks?
Yeah, I'm not, I can't comment because I don't know the answer to that, but I will say that Samuel Cisneros, he works at the Center for Southwest Research, he's one of the archivists, and after the Mexican-American War, his master's thesis was on the Nuevo Mexicanos who migrated south, and they became Chihuahuenses, as opposed to the folks who migrated, other places throughout the American West. After the Mexican-American War, there were about 100,000 individuals living in what is now the Southwest who decided to become U.S. citizens. And so about 75,000 of those were located in New Mexico. So the political power kind of makes sense in the region because of the just sheer number of Hispanos that were here who had already amassed a good amount of political power anyway. My family is, I haven't traveled further down. I think the next after the 1930s and 40s was really thinking about copper mining, which is not my expertise. It's other folks' expertise in the room. But my grandfather was born in Miami, Arizona, and so there's a lot of connections to be made also with mining families who migrated from places like Chihuahua and Sonora over to Arizona, and even to New Mexico to work in the zinc mines, for example. And so there's plentiful research on those areas. So I kind of don't touch it because a lot of people do it, and they do it well. But yeah, I am aware of kind of those migration patterns, but not the distinctions between Chihuahuenses and Sonorenses necessarily.
It dawned on me.
Yeah.
There were two distinctive states. Anybody else have any thoughts or questions? Yes, sir. Wait. I'm getting there. Just hold on. Don't
We make
rush
the
me.
men work on Women's Day. Okay.
You mentioned how in New Mexico, a lot of families politically, economically identified as being Spaniards or having descended from Spaniards, which a lot of them did, but that trend to Hispanicize names and places, that also happened all over the Southwest, because I'm from Los Angeles originally, and I remember there was a time when, like, there's a restaurant, the Spanish American food,
Right.
and it's like, really, it's Mexican food, but in order to avoid the stigmatization or to attract other different types of clients, they call it Spanish American food. So that's a pretty common, I don't want to call it a defense mechanism, but it may be.
Yeah, and I mean, after Juan de Oñate came to New Mexico in the late 1500s, after that there were Jesuit priests and other, Franciscan friars who were going throughout the Southwest to settle, right? So that's why you have the whole mission trail in California. That's why you have the San Xavier mission. You have all these different, so first they came to New Mexico and then they went throughout the Southwest. So it had a lot of influence on the way places were being named. More recently, I think in Arizona and both in New Mexico, you're now seeing these attempts to indigenize names as opposed to Hispanicizing them. And so people really, even I think now in La Victoria, they're changing names from KKK members named streets to more prominent individuals who are part of marginalized communities. I saw a very lively next door thread about it last night. So, yeah.
One of the things I think too to keep in mind, we're always giving credit to Charles Trumbull Hayden, who is the one who is responsible, I guess, for settling what became Tempe and the folks over in Phoenix. But long before Anglos, of course, there were the indigenous cultures that created the canals and the ability to irrigate what would otherwise be desert. But folks from Mexico were here in the area long before any Anglo, and nobody's recognized for that. We just recognize the Anglos that came along, and now it's an Anglo city.
Well, and this is part of the whole Querencia framework in recognizing the knowledge that exists in place, right? So as folks, who's not from Arizona in the room? Okay, so as you're coming to Arizona and settling here, that idea of tarea de obligación, or fundamental responsibility to become aware and to learn about what was here before you, is really important because you have to be able to acknowledge those histories that came before you, because it helped to create what you now get to experience, right? And so the other kind of line of research that I work on is the way that colonial legacies kind of manifest within the Southwest. So I write a lot about monuments and memory and the way that colonialism rears its ugly head every day. But that's separate but not necessarily unrelated from what this storytelling initiative is.
Well, I learned a lot today. I still don't understand some of your credentials, but that's all right. It seems like you know what you're talking about.
Academics, yes.
I am not a scholar. I'm just the humble introducer. Thank you so
much. And I
much.
appreciate you for that.
Thank you so much for coming. Let's give her another big hand.
Thank you, everybody.
Don't go away yet.
And I'd love to write names and contact information for all of you who have lovely stories to share. And gather in a Resolana space to continue conversation.
Oh, no. If you take that away, I won't know what I'm doing. Yes, thank you. But wait a minute, before you go, a couple of things. We always try to give a memento of a visit, and I've talked about him a lot. Richard Nearing was our wonderful pen and ink artist who came much later in life to doing this. This was not his career, but he was a very good friend, although I wanted to break his hands many times because of his ability to do this. I can't draw a straight line. So this is the Wolf Sachs house, one of the older homes. It is been relocated, but it's still here, built in 1896 and signed by Richard Nearing. So that's kind of a souvenir of our, and then we have a small gift for you there. That's it. Thank you very much. Yes. We'll see you back again. Next month, we have 2 more programs, lunch talks. We've expanded our series to include now September through May, and that gives us an opportunity to invite even more people. Next month is Kathy Nakagawa, and she is representing something that I am really interested in. Being a historian and a preservationist, I rue all the things that we have lost over the years. And one of the greatest losses wasn't so much a building, but a place. And that was the flower gardens on Baseline Road. And Kathy represents the family that operated one of those farms. And if you've been around long enough and you inhale deeply, you can still smell that incredible fragrance. So Kathy will be here next month. Desert Blooms, Stories of the Japanese American Flower Gardens on Baseline Road. And sort of in that vein, then in May, Lynn Nemeth will be here from Boyce Thompson Arboretum. Has everybody been up there? If you haven't, you need to go there. It is an absolutely incredible place, and it isn't like the Desert Botanical Gardens. It's a whole different affair, and it's in one of the most picturesque spots in Arizona. So we'll be thrilled to have Lynn Nemeth coming in May. Also want to point out, Marlise is in the back of the room. We have a really impressive sheet of paper back there, but we are working on our plans for next year, the 2023-2024 season, and we'd like your input. If you know somebody who you think would be a great speaker at Lunch Talks, or a subject that you have a real interest in and would like us to research, just jot it down here on this paper. I don't know why we have your name, email, and phone. You don't have to do that. If you want to, then we'll grill down and find out why you want that person. But we're more interested in what you think of the Lunch Talks. And some of the things we're considering for next season includes the history of the Harkins Theaters, old business signs in Tempe and Mesa. I believe we're going to have an exhibit in the fall or next spring on that subject. Canals in Tempe, a virtual tour of those. We would not be here today if it weren't for the canals that were built prehistorically and then revived later on. Some really good programs coming up for the next season, and I want to thank again Friendship Village and Mark Young for the continued support when we do these programs. A few things this Friday, and all of these are free at the museum. We're really a cheap place. And speaking of cheap, how many are members of the society? Oh, this is much better than we've done in the past. All of the others, get out. I don't want to talk to you. Or go to the desk there and sign up, or talk to Marlise. She'll get you signed up as a member. It's really cheap, but it helps us when we go out for grants and things of that sort, because a lot of grantors want to know what kind of support an organization like the Society gets, and we measure that through our membership. So we hope that you'll consider that. Friday, March 10th, that's this Friday, Las Calacas will be here for an outdoor concert. On March 21st, the African American Advisory Committee has been doing a series of community chats, and from 6 to 8 p.m. here at the museum, wellness more than an absence of illness. So I think we could all use that a little bit. And then April 7th, Jaleo, and then we still have performances coming up in May that we'll talk about next time. So again, I want to thank everybody for coming out today. I want to thank Vanessa for an incredible presentation and bringing Arizona and New Mexico together. At one time, it was all New Mexico, and then it got divided in various different ways, so it's really homogeneous. Yeah?
Talking about keeping your stories alive, I'm going to put her on the spot. We have an administrator here with Arizona Barrio Stories, Irma Payan, and she could probably tell you a little bit about her organization. Right over there in the corner.
Okay.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good.
My name is Irma, and I help administer Arizona Barrio Stories, and it's a site where people tell stories. We invite everybody that has roots in Arizona. We don't turn down anybody. If you have a story, and there's a lot of transplants that do claim Arizona as their home, they may not have been born here. We are on Facebook. If you don't do social media, we are also on YouTube. We're on Instagram. We're on Channel 11 of Glendale Cox. But we are always looking for, and I call it the untold story. There are many stories out there that people feel that aren't important. And we feel every story is important. Anyhow, if you have the chance to visit us, we are Arizona Barrio Stories. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we've got a future lunch talk presentation. Carter Rogers is chairing the committee that puts the lunch talks together, so that's another, if invited, you would come. Okay, and if elected, you would serve? I don't know where I got that. All right, thank you all very much. Have a great afternoon, a wonderful spring month in March, and we will see you on April 12th.